I'm Tikhon Bernstam, and I'm talking about how I got into Y Combinator 2 times and the lessons I learned along the way. I founded a company called Scribd in 2006. I was actually in graduate school at the time and applied, and I dropped out when I was admitted. And then I founded a company called Parse 5 years later in Y Combinator Summer 11. I'm also an angel investor in north of 80 companies, including Cruise Automation, which sold to GM, Reddit, Optimizely, Tilt, Checker, which YC Continuity just did a round in, LendUp, Gusto, which is $1 billion company, Comma AI, a self-driving company that's not YC, and Razorpay, which is a company you may be familiar with. So I'm a founder, I'm an angel investor, and I'm a developer by training since I was 12 and a 2-time Y Combinator alum. Now, YC is overall, it's an accelerator for early stage startups. It's ideally geared toward companies that have found product market fit and can benefit from the partner's expertise on growth and distribution. They've been investors in all kinds of amazing companies, from Instacart to WePay, Docker, Twitch, of course, is $1 billion exit, LendUp, Dropbox, multi-billion-dollar company, Checker, Weebly, it's a $1 billion plus company, Stripe, multi-billion, Reddit, Airbnb, of course. So back to this slide, which you missed. As of this month, Y Combinator has now funded over 1,300 companies. The market cap of the entire YC portfolio is north of $70 billion. Airbnb, of course, is worth about $30 billion based on the last financing, which is interesting to think about, one company being worth roughly 3/7, let's say, very roughly, of the overall portfolio. Y Combinator companies have raised north of $10 billion from venture capitalists and angel investors. The number of unicorns or bigger from YC is 10, but actually it's higher than that. But that's based on the last valuations from the last funding rounds. And the number of YC companies worth over $100 million is at least 52. So as I was saying, so I started Parse in summer 11. We sold it in 2 years to Facebook for $85 million in 2013. And Scribd, of course, is the world's largest document sharing site that we began 10 years ago in 2006. And it's used by companies like Goldman Sachs and New York Times for embedding documents into their web pages. But it's also used as a sort of Netflix for ebooks, is the main principal use case now. So as I was saying, stealing a slide from Michael Seibel, the way Y Combinator works, the program, is that your startup must move to Silicon Valley and preferably to Mountain View, California, south of Stanford, for 3 months. If the founders are not willing to do that, that's usually a deal breaker. And then those 3 months you spend working closely with the partners and the alumni of YC, the thousands of alums, to launch your successful minimum viable product, to raise money, to get advice on growth and distribution and product market fit. But finally, on demo day, which is roughly 11 weeks after you begin, you present to the Valley's best investors, from Ron Conway to all the famous venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, to all the best angels in the world who show up for demo day. So one thing Y Combinator does look for, they admit solo founders, but it's a much tougher road to climb if you are by yourself. And so if you're trying to get in, you're better off having between 2 to 4 co-founders, and you should all know each other. You shouldn't just have been working together for 1 week before your application. You should preferably have known each other for years or have worked together on projects in some context. But really, there's much more than that. Ideally, in your application, you'd like to be able to demonstrate a huge growing market. You want to show founder market fit, why you as founders know that market better than most anyone else in that space. So such that you have a secret in the Peter Thiel sense, that you know something, some contrarian idea that other folks in that space just aren't familiar with, or might think is incorrect, but that gives you an edge to do something disruptive in the space. Now, showing traction or growth, like if you can show strong week over week or month over month growth numbers in revenue or number of users, that's of course great. And it doesn't hurt to have at least half the team be technical. So if you have 3 founders, say at least 2 people, 2 of them should be technical. That's not, and there are lots of exceptions, but those are good general guidelines that have been discussed by the YC partners. But the number one thing that YC really looks for is that you are determined, that you will persevere through all of the hard times, because every company from Airbnb to Stripe to Dropbox, they all had times when things didn't feel like they were working. And it's YC as an early stage investor, I think they like to think about which founders will persevere. So even when a lot of people didn't like the idea of Airbnb, for instance, Paul Graham said to the founders, well, you know, you guys are like cockroaches. I just don't think you're going to give up. Like, you're going to survive anything. And I mean, when those guys couldn't raise money from all the VCs for that year after demo day, they even went to DC, to Washington, DC, and sold cereal that they custom made based on the election, Obama O's and Captain McCain's, that were really just Cheerios that they had reboxed and were marking up. But that's one of the most important things, is that you want to show you're a founder who won't just quit one month into the program or 6 months afterwards. Ultimately, YC's motto is make something people want, which is from a Paul Graham essay. But fundamentally, they look for products and teams that have made something that users do want. One way to do this is solving your own problem. So a problem you understand, maybe you've worked with a set of software in a market, or you're deep in a market, and you understand that the competitive landscape is such that you can build a 10x better product and take over the market the way Drew did with Dropbox, for instance. But as Paul Blukeit has noted, what you really want to do is to make a few users really, really happy. If you make a lot of people say like, oh, cool, it's unlikely that your product's actually gonna really work, because all the biggest success stories have been companies that like made some people just passionate advocates for the product, so they would spread the product by word of mouth. And so while you can fake growth, you can spend money on ads, and you can sell $1 for 90 cents for so long, it's not sustainable, but you can do it. It's really hard to fake user passion for your product where you have strong product market fit. And so I think one really good judge of whether you've figured things out is whether your product is so good that your users tell their friends to use it. The way I told my friends to use Stripe, because it made it so much easier to collect payments, and that you no longer had to deal with, you know, faxing back and forth wet signatures in order to open a merchant account, just for instance. But it was a developer-focused, developer-first payments API, and nothing else like that existed. So in spite of lots of people saying, why do we need another Stripe or another PayPal, another Braintree, it's because Stripe built something 10x better. And so it's why I like to think about being a last mover as opposed to a first mover. So all these companies above, Google, Stripe, Dropbox, Facebook, they were not first to their market. Google, there were dozens of search engines like Excite, Alta Vista, et cetera, before them. In Dropbox's space, there were public companies doing virtually the same thing as them. In Stripe's case, like I said, PayPal, Braintree, Facebook famously had, you know, MySpace and others, Friendster. But what distinguishes these companies were that these founders were extraordinary. They had incredible work ethics. And they shipped 10x better products than anything else that existed in fragmented markets where no one really knew what to use. And they therefore all had passionate user bases that actually all spread their products by word of mouth. So Google famously didn't spend any money on marketing. Stripe was largely spread by word of mouth in the early days, as was Dropbox. And Facebook, of course, was just spreading like crazy across campuses. So it's worth noting, even if you apply to Y Combinator like Drew did and you were rejected, showing perseverance and applying again is a good thing. So not giving up, like just going after it. Sam Altman with Luke actually was initially rejected and then flew out to argue his case, and they were so overcome by like his just what a hardworking and good, like what a strong passion he had for what he was doing, that they let him into that first batch. But ultimately, whether or not you do YC, startups will often just feel like a roller coaster. Like some days you'll think you're on top of the world, and others you'll think your company's going out of business. This used to be for years, actually, in the first 5 years of Y Combinator, on the whiteboard of YC. And it kind of highlights really how, despite everything else, despite fundraising, despite hiring, despite what you might think is product market fit, there's lots of ups and downs, and it's very emotionally like a roller coaster, this sort of all the ups and downs. And so it's the founders who can persevere and who make it through all the downtimes, but also who don't overreact in the up times, who actually make it. Now, sometimes I'm asked, like, well, I'd like to apply to YC, but I don't have an idea. And YC does accept extraordinary founders who do not have an idea, but there's other ways of approaching this problem. Like, for one, many of the current portfolio founders worked for other YC companies, and during their time there, they found problems with other products that they didn't like. And then they used those to apply with strong references from the other YC network founders. Other things you can do are looking at software that you use every day that really just makes you cringe, that's really painful to use, but successful anyway. Because that might mean, like Drewsoft or Dropbox, that you can make something 10x better. And finally, if you see poorly executed products that are still winning, that generally indicates a good market. So you can look at something like the Inc. I believe it's Inc. 5000 fastest growing companies list. And often you'll just see a market has really started growing quickly, and most of the products in it are crap. So some common concerns I hear from potential YC applicants: some don't want to share their idea. They're scared of, people hearing their idea and running away with it. But the truth is, if you're like Airbnb, you could email every top VC in the world about your product and have Paul Graham personally write them, and they still won't get it for a long time until you can show great traction. So another concern, my friend Justin Kahn has a great tweet that he wrote about this. Startups often say, like, oh, I'd like to do this, but someone else is already doing it, or there's already a company doing that, but that's generally a good sign. So a lot of investors miss Dropbox because they told Drew, well, your market's too fragmented, there's too many competitors, but that's generally a sign there's no killer product. And so if you can come in and drop a 10x better product and out execute everyone else, you can win the way that Drew did. And finally, yeah, so this is an old pick from YC that PG doesn't actually like very much, but all these folks were just like you and were applying to Y Combinator at one point in time. And so I would just encourage you to, if you want to do a company, to think about finding that idea that you want to work on for a long time, that has the potential to be an interesting company, and you're just really dedicating yourself to it. All right, well, thank you. That's the extent of my slides and presentation. Okay, so one question from the audience. So since Y Combinator has been investing in India, it gives a hint that they'll have a full-time accelerator there. Do I think that will happen soon? I am not a partner at Y Combinator, just like I should reiterate this. While I'm an investor in many YC companies, and I have friends who are partners, like I am a founder and investor. But that said, YC has been funding more companies out of India, and I think that's a really good thing. I think companies like Razorpay have done a really great job. I was an early investor in Razorpay along with Justin Kahn. And this last batch, we had, I think, more companies from India than ever before. And I expect that trend to continue because the markets there have been growing and the opportunities there are getting better. One hindrance is that I think most value investors will expect you to be a Delaware C Corp. And so given that, you'll want to make sure that you can in some way incorporate as a Delaware C Corp. But otherwise, I have no idea whether, I find it hard to believe that they would be able to focus on having accelerators around the world. Some venture capital firms like Matrix and Sequoia, there's Matrix India, Sequoia has sort of outposts in China and India, Singapore. So there's more and more focus on investing outside of the US, but ultimately most US investors will typically want to be investing in US-based companies focusing on the US market. And even with Razorpay, one of the success stories, they raised from Tiger, of course, for their Series A. So another question from the audience. What were the top key problems I faced while launching Scribd? Well, there were a lot of those. Scribd was actually our 12th idea. So we had launched 11 other things that just didn't work. And let me see if I can pull up. No, I can't. So with Scribd, we could never raise money. We wasted months of time trying to raise money before we had product market fit. And we would often decry that the investors just didn't get it and but the truth is, if your idea is any good, most investors won't get it. Much like Airbnb faced, and a lot of great companies like Uber was on Angel List. Anyone could have invested into Uber pre-Series A for quite a long time. And so the ideas that are instantly that take off and that seem obvious are often the ones that flame out and are actually not great companies. And it's a bad experience for both the founders and the investors and the employees. But with Scribd in particular, could not raise money until we really had traction, until just we had launched and it was just obviously taking off. And I mean, we spent a good 18 months with no money, just bootstrapping it and trying to launch other ideas that weren't working. And so every month we push out a new idea, and after a month we cut them off. And Scribd was really the first one that worked. All right, another question. What is the best time for founders to apply with regards to their experience in the industry? Are founders with some work experience preferred over freshly graduated founders without much work experience? So it's an interesting question. And I think for B2B enterprise type stuff, often work experience is helpful in the sense that you begin to understand what the enterprise sales cycle might look like, and you understand more how distribution works. Because if you're trying to make, say, Workday, which is north of $14 billion company with roughly 500 customers, it's just a very different business than doing something like Airbnb that's more B2C marketplace than Facebook, which is B2C, and then ultimately a media business or an ad business. Now, so I actually think that for B2B and enterprise, it's very helpful for founders if they do spend some time suffering through the enterprise world, because otherwise you'll never have what's called founder market fit. So I asked Drew Houston of Dropbox, the CEO and founder, what he thinks about early stage startups. And he says he looks for two things. He looks for founder market fit, meaning that founder knows that market better than really almost anyone else around, can tell you about the whole competitive landscape, and can tell you what their sort of secret is in that Peter Thiel sense, and also huge growing market. But huge growing market is tough because companies like eBay and Facebook arguably created their markets, and that's harder. So, but for most investors, it's easier to understand markets that already exist. And for instance, Sequoia, the VC firm, thinks a lot about market first. And while you may have a company that expands the market the way that, say, Lyft Line, UberX, Uberpool have done in the taxi market, making it much, much larger, it's a much easier way to go your first time around, not trying to expand the market. And even a company like Airbnb, I would argue, is still in this sort of hotelish space, but in this sort of, on the consumer side, cheaper places to stay, and on the host side, an easier way to make money as a sort of small scale, motel, hotel. And one final question, since we're out of time and it's past 1 a.m. Eastern time in New York where I am. What's the best way to reach me, Tikhon, to pitch an investment? And how do I look at markets outside of the Valley, in the USA in particular? And I'm interested in Indian startups. So the best way to reach me personally is either on Twitter, where my handle is Tikhon, but the same works for Gmail, so tikhon@gmail.com. And in terms of markets outside of the Valley, I confess that I do try to focus mostly on US-based companies, and that's only because I think investors go awry when they invest in places that they don't understand. So I will never understand the market in India as well as the founders of, say, Razorpay, or as well as many of you. And so for me, it's hard for me as an angel to actually be helpful. Suppose I want to help you, like I often won't understand the sets of problems you have, because my experience is very limited in a lot of ways. I come from Silicon Valley, where fundraising is different, where hiring is different, where the way consumers think about paying for things is different. And so while I invested in Razorpay, that was based purely on the founders. I basically was so convinced those founders were going to succeed that I would have bet on them on most anything they were doing. And I have a set of questions I ask founders to try to kind of gauge whether I think they'll give up or persevere. But I've rarely met a set of founders as inspiring as the founders of Razorpay, and I'm thrilled to be an investor. It's one of my largest investments I've ever made, in fact. And I'm really, really excited about the company. So. Hey, well, thank you all so much for taking the time and listening. I think I'll wind down now. You can now continue listening to the Trump-Clinton debate from a few hours ago, which is what most of the folks I know are still doing. So, all right, I hope that helps, and feel free to reach out to me either on Twitter or email if I can be helpful in any way. And thanks again for taking the time.